The hiss of the steam engine was a long, mournful sigh, a sound of finality that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the cold afternoon. It was the sound of a journey's end, and for Claire Maddox, it might as well have been the sound of the world holding its breath, waiting to pass judgment. As she stepped down from the carriage, her worn leather boots making a soft thud on the splintered wood of the platform, the air bit at her exposed cheeks. It was a thin, sharp cold, laced with the ever-present scent of coal smoke and damp earth that clung to the town of Elkridge like a shroud. She stood for a moment, a solitary, still figure against the backdrop of departing passengers and greetings. Her trunk, a sturdy but scuffed thing of dark wood and brass fittings, was set down beside her by a porter who gave her a single, incurious glance before moving on. Claire clutched the handle of her worn reticule, the crisp edges of a letter inside a faint comfort against her gloved palm. That letter had been her map, her compass, her reason for crossing half a continent. It had been filled with carefully penned words of promise, of a new life, a home, a husband, a man named Charles Hammond. Her eyes scanned the small crowd gathered on the platform. Elkridge was not the bustling hubs of the East she had left behind. It was a raw, functional place, carved into the side of a gray mountain that loomed over the town like a silent, unforgiving god. The buildings were simple, unpainted wood, their false fronts doing little to hide their crude construction. The street beyond the station was a ribbon of thick, churned mud. This was a place of work, of grit, of men who tore a living from the earth's belly. It was a place, she had hoped, where substance might matter more than form. She saw him before he saw her. He matched the description in his letters, a man of medium height, with hair the color of corn silk and a neatly trimmed mustache. He was dressed well for a miner, in a clean wool coat and a derby hat set at a confident angle. He was standing near the station master's office, his gaze sweeping over the women alighting from the train, a faint, expectant smile on his lips. He was looking for a picture, a dream sent by post. Claire took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and began to walk towards him. With each step, she was aware of her own presence, an awareness that had been honed by years of ill-fitting spaces and surprised glances. She was a tall woman, standing a head taller than many of the men who now turned to watch her approach. Her shoulders were broad, not from fashion, but from labor, and her hands, though gloved, were capable and strong. The face beneath her simple brown bonnet was not one of delicate, porcelain beauty. It was a face shaped by weather and worry, with clear, steady gray eyes that had seen too much to feign coyness. She was 32 years old, and the road to Elkridge had been the least of the hard journeys she had undertaken. As she drew nearer, Charles Hammond's searching gaze finally landed on her. For a fleeting second, there was confusion in his eyes. Then, as she stopped a respectable few feet from him, the expectant smile on his face faltered, withered, and died. He looked from her face, down the length of her plain, durable traveling dress, to her sturdy boots peeking from beneath the hem, and back up again. A slow, creeping tide of disbelief and then disapproval washed over his features. The crowd, sensing a drama unfolding, grew quiet. The murmur of conversation ceased, replaced by a focused, hungry silence. Mr. Charles Hammond. Claire's voice was low and even, betraying none of the sudden, cold dread that was beginning to coil in her stomach. He blinked, as if her speaking had broken a spell. He took a small, almost imperceptible step back. "I am," he said, his tone clipped and cool. He did not ask her name. He knew. It was the fact of her, the physical reality of her standing before him. That was the problem. "I am Claire Maddox." She stated it simply. A fact, not an introduction. She did not offer her hand. His remained stiffly at his side. He gave a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. It was a sound of dismissal. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. He wasn't speaking to her, she realized, but to the audience. He was performing for the town, distancing himself from the error that now stood before him. "The letters," Claire began, her own voice quieter now, the word catching in her throat. "The letters," he interrupted, his voice hardening, spoke of a respectable woman, a woman of gentle constitution. He gestured vaguely with his hand, a dismissive flick of the wrist that took in all of her height, her strength, the weathered lines around her eyes. They did not describe this. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp as a miner's pick. Asterisk this asterisk. Not a woman, not a person, but a thing. An object that did not match the order. A shipment of goods found to be damaged upon arrival. The humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over her face, followed by an icy chill that settled deep in her bones. She could feel the stares of the townspeople. Some curious, some pitying, some openly scornful. She had become a spectacle in the space of a dozen heartbeats. "You are not what a man imagines for a wife," he continued, his indignation growing, feeding on the silent attention of the crowd. "A wife should be smaller, softer, a comfort to a man's eye. You look as though you could swing a hammer alongside the best of them." A few men chuckled at that, a low, rumbling sound of agreement. To them, it was a fine joke. To Claire, it was the final turning of a key in a lock she had been trapped behind her entire life. She looked directly at him then, her gray eyes meeting his pale blue ones. She saw no room for appeal, no flicker of doubt or compassion. She saw only the shallow pride of a small man who felt cheated of his prize. He had envisioned a delicate flower to press between the pages of his life, and instead, he had been sent a sturdy oak. He could not see the value in its strength, only that it would not fit in his pretty vase. Without another word, Claire turned. She did not run, she did not weep. The tears were a frozen lump in her throat, too cold and hard to fall. With a straight back and a measured pace, she walked to her trunk, bent, and lifted it. The weight was considerable, but she swung it up as if it were a simple valise, the muscles in her back and arms pulling tight. It was a final, unconscious act of the very capability he had just condemned. She walked away from the platform, away from Charles Hammond and his shattered picture, away from the watching eyes of Elkridge. She did not look back. She followed the muddy track that served as the main street, her head held high, though she saw nothing of the town she passed through. She saw only the ghost of the hope she had carried, a flickering candle flame that had been unceremoniously snuffed out by a puff of masculine vanity. Her steps were mechanical, one boot placed deliberately in front of the other, seeking the relative solidity of the boardwalks when she could. She had no destination. The letter in her reticule, once a promise, was now just paper and ink, a worthless contract. She had come all this way for a life that had ceased to exist the moment she stepped off the train. She found a spot at the far end of town, where the last of the sad, gray buildings gave way to a scattering of discarded mining carts and splintered timbers. No one was there. The noise of the town was a muted hum behind her. She lowered her trunk to the damp ground and sank down to sit on it, her back against the cold, rough wood of a dilapidated shed. The cold began to seep through her coat, a deep, invasive chill that had little to do with the weather. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared out at the unforgiving landscape of rock and pine. And she thought, she did not think of Charles Hammond. He was merely the latest voice in a chorus that had sung the same song her whole life. She thought of her father, a good man, who had always said, with a sigh of confused pride, "Claire, my girl, you have too much substance for your own good." She thought of the young men in her hometown who had danced with the smaller, giggling girls, while she stood by the wall, a silent, tall sentinel. She thought of the foremen and the officers she had worked for during the war, mending uniforms and tents, who praised her tireless work but looked at her with an uneasy respect, as if her competence was an unnatural, unfeminine thing. Asterisk. Too much asterisk. The words echoed in the hollow space inside her. Too tall, too strong, too quiet, too capable, too plain, too much, always. She was an excess, a surplus that men did not know what to do with. They wanted a woman who would need them, who would make them feel large and important by her very delicacy. They did not want a woman who looked as if she could weather the same storms they did, and perhaps stand taller in the end. She had dared to hope Elkridge would be different. A new place, a practical place, where a strong back and a steady hand would be seen as assets, not liabilities. She had allowed herself to believe the words in Charles Hammond's letters, to build a fragile future upon them. Now, that future lay in ruins around her feet, as desolate as the landscape before her. A gust of wind swept down from the mountain, carrying with it the scent of snow. It whipped a loose strand of her brown hair across her face, and she did not bother to tuck it back in. She sat on her trunk, alone at the edge of a strange town, and for the first time in the long, arduous journey, she felt the full, crushing weight of her solitude. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for women who believed someone might come to comfort them. Claire Maddox had learned long ago that the only person who would ever come for her was herself. And at that moment, she wasn't sure if that was enough. The light had begun to fail, the sharp edges of the afternoon softening into the bruised purple of dusk. A deep, penetrating cold was now creeping from the ground, a damp chill that promised a frost by morning. Claire hadn't moved. She had simply sat, letting the stillness outside match the frozen landscape within her. The town of Elkridge carried on behind her, its sounds the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a heavy-laden wagon, the faint strains of a poorly played piano from a saloon serving only to deepen her sense of isolation. She was an island, and the tide of the world was receding around her. She didn't hear him approach at first. The ground was hard and his steps were quiet, the steps of a man used to moving through the wilderness without announcement. What she noticed was a subtle shift in the air, a solid presence where before there had been only emptiness. She looked up, her body tensing, her hand instinctively tightening on her reticule. He stood a respectful distance away, not imposing, his shadow long in the fading light. He was tall, leaner than the broad-shouldered miners, with a frame that spoke of sinew and endurance rather than brute strength. He was leading a handsome bay gelding, its reins held loosely in a gloved hand. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, worn and comfortable-looking, and a plain, wide-brimmed hat that was pulled low, shadowing his face. He wasn't looking at her with the overt, consuming curiosity she had felt from everyone else. His gaze was indirect, resting somewhere on the distant mountain peak, as if he had just happened to stop here to admire the view. He let the silence stretch, giving her time to see that he was no threat, that he was not there to gawk or to question. He was a man who understood the language of quiet spaces. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and calm, a gravelly baritone that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Evenin'," he said, simply. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite acknowledgement. Claire said nothing. She merely watched him, her gray eyes narrowed with a caution that had become second nature. She was a stray dog, braced for a kick, and she knew it. The man didn't press for a response. He shifted his weight, and the horse beside him blew out a soft, steamy breath. He had likely come from the north, from the open country that lay beyond the town's grubby reach. He seemed to carry the scent of it with him of pine and cold stone and leather. "Gets cold fast when the sun drops behind that ridge," he observed, his gaze still fixed on the mountain. He was talking to the air, to the horse, to the evening itself. He was allowing her to just be a bystander to his thoughts, relieving her of the obligation to engage. Still, she remained silent, Words were a currency she did not have to spare, especially for strangers. Every word she had spoken today had led to this desolate perch on her own trunk. The man finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers. They were not what she expected. In a town of hard men with eyes like chips of flint, his were a different shade entirely. They were a deep, steady brown, the color of wet earth, and they held a profound quietness. There was no pity in them, no condescension, and, most importantly, no judgment. He didn't look at her as if she were a problem to be solved or a curiosity to be dissected. He just looked at her, a woman sitting alone in the cold. He saw her. "There's a boarding house," he said, his voice even and direct. "Run by a widow, Agnes Wells. She keeps a clean place, has a spare room." He paused, then added, "I can show you the way." It was a simple statement of fact, a practical offering. He wasn't asking what she would do, or why she was there. He wasn't referencing the humiliating spectacle at the train station, though news of it had surely spread through Elkridge like wildfire. He was offering a roof and a bed, nothing more. Her first instinct, sharp and protective, was to refuse. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight, rusty from disuse. The words were a lie, and they both knew it. She was anything but fine. She was adrift, and the night was drawing in. He did not argue. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer. In that look, she saw an understanding that went beyond words. He knew she wasn't fine, but he accepted her need to say she was. He was giving her the dignity of her own defenses, however flimsy they might be. He gave a slow, small nod, as if to say, asterisk, all right, then asterisk. He prepared to turn away, to leave her to the pride and the cold she had chosen. It was that act, his willingness to let her be, to respect her refusal without question, that broke through her armor. The others had stared, had whispered, had judged. Charles Hammond had publicly dissected and dismissed her. This man simply offered a hand and, when it was refused, prepared to walk away without a backward glance. His lack of insistence was a strange and powerful sort of kindness. "Wait," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. He stopped, turning back to her patiently. He did not smile in triumph. He just waited. She looked at his steady eyes again and saw not a rescuer, but a guide, a man offering a path out of the immediate darkness. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she gave a single, sharp nod. The gesture felt monumental, a concession that cost her the last of her ragged pride. He nodded in return, accepting her decision as quietly as he had accepted her refusal. He walked over, his steps sure in the dimming light. "I'm Reed Callahan," he said, by way of a belated introduction. He gestured towards her trunk. "May I?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second before sliding off the trunk and stepping aside. Without any show of effort, he bent and lifted the heavy chest, settling its weight easily in his arms. He then turned and started back towards the faint lights of the town, expecting her to follow. The horse fell into step behind him, its presence a calm, breathing shadow. Claire took a moment, her hands clasped before her, and then she followed. They walked in silence. It was not the charged, uncomfortable silence of the platform, filled with unspoken thoughts and piercing stares. This was a different creature altogether. It was a wide, open silence, like the vast, darkening sky above them. It was a silence that did not demand to be filled. As they walked, Claire watched him. He moved with an economy of motion, his stride long and easy. He was a man who was at home in his own body, in his own silence. He walked along the edge of the muddy street, choosing the firmest ground for her, though he himself was wearing sturdy, scuffed boots that could handle any terrain. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He seemed to trust that she was. This quiet trust was a balm. In Reed Callahan's presence, she felt the tight knot of watchfulness in her chest begin to loosen. Just a fraction. He wasn't trying to manage her, or fix her, or possess her. He was simply walking beside her, sharing the path. His silence wasn't cold or dismissive. It felt patient. It felt like a space he was holding open for her, a space where she did not have to be anyone or explain anything. It was a silence that was waiting for her to be ready to be herself again. The people they passed a miner heading towards the saloon. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store cast curious glances their way. They saw the tall, strange woman from the train platform walking with Reed Callahan, the quiet man who ran the horse ranch north of town. They saw him carrying her trunk. Whispers would follow. Conclusions would be drawn. But for the first time that day, Claire found she didn't care. Reed's quiet dignity acted as a shield. He acknowledged no one, his focus solely on the path ahead, and his composure made their stares feel small and insignificant. They reached a modest but well-kept two-story house set back from the main street. A sign hanging from the porch read, "Wells Boarding House, Rooms and Meals." Warm yellow light spilled from the downstairs windows, a beacon against the encroaching night. It looked safe. It looked warm. Reed set her trunk down on the porch with a soft thud. He turned to her, his face now illuminated by the lamplight from the window. She could see the lines etched around his eyes. Lines not of worry, but of wind and sun. He looked like a man who spent more time looking at horizons than at faces. "Mrs. Wells is a fair woman," he said. "She'll see you right." He gave her another one of his slight, slow nods. He did not wait for thanks. He did not linger. He simply turned, took his horse's reins, and began to walk away, his form melting back into the darkness from which he had come. Claire stood on the porch for a long time, watching him go, the weight of his quiet, unexpected decency settling over her. He hadn't asked a single question. He hadn't offered a single word of pity. He had simply seen a person in need of a safe harbor and had pointed the way. In the loud, brutal chaos of her day, his quiet respect was the first kind thing she had known. She took a breath, the cold air no longer feeling quite so hostile, and raised her hand to knock on the door. Agnes Wells was a woman built of the same sturdy, unadorned timber as her boarding house. Her face was a roadmap of a hard life, but her eyes were clear and shrewd, missing nothing. When she opened the door to Claire that first night, she took in the tall, solitary figure on her porch, the expensive but worn trunk, and the deep, settled weariness in her expression. She had seen the drama at the train station from her front window, as had most of Elk Ridge. She simply nodded, named a fair price for a room and 2 meals a day, and after Claire paid for a week in advance with the last of her travel money, showed her upstairs. The room was small, tucked under the eaves at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small washstand with a basin and pitcher, a single straight-backed chair, and one window that looked out over a scraggly yard towards the rising slope of the mountain. It was spare, but it was meticulously clean. The air smelled of dried lavender and lye soap. To Claire, it felt like a fortress. It was a space that was hers alone, a place to close the door and let the rigid set of her shoulders finally fall. In the days that followed, Claire established a quiet routine. She was the first to rise, long before the sun crested the mountain, and the last to put out her lamp. She took her meals in the corner of the communal dining room, speaking only when spoken to, offering polite, brief answers that discouraged further conversation. She was a ghost at the table, a silent presence that the other boarders, mostly minors with long-term arrangements, quickly learned to leave alone. She was not unfriendly, merely self-contained, a closed book that invited no one to read its pages. On the third day, she unpacked the tools of her trade. They were her true possessions, more valuable than the few dresses in her trunk. Polished steel needles of varying sizes in a felt case, heavy-duty thimbles worn smooth from use, spools of waxed linen thread, a sharp cutting blade, a sturdy leather-working awl. She cleared the small table by the window, arranged her implements with practiced care, and began her life anew. It started with a tear in one of Mrs. Wells's aprons, which Claire mended with stitches so small and even they were nearly invisible. The widow looked at the repair, then at Claire's capable hands, and gave a single, appreciative grunt. The next day, she brought Claire a basket of worn linens from the boarding house. Claire spent the next 2 days patching sheets and darning tablecloths, her needle rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm that was the only language she truly trusted. She asked for no payment, but Mrs. Wells deducted a generous amount from her next week's rent. A silent, practical understanding was struck between them. Word, as it does in a small town, began to travel on the wind. It was not a loud proclamation, but a series of quiet observations. Mrs. Wells mentioned to the wife of the general store owner that the new woman was uncommonly skilled with a needle. A miner, grumbling about a torn seam in his only good coat, was told to try the tall woman at the Wells house. He came to her door hesitantly, the heavy wool coat clutched in his hand. Claire took it without a word, and returned it to him the next morning. The seam not merely repaired, but reinforced with a strength the original maker had never intended. He pressed a coin into her hand. His gruff, "Much obliged," a testament to a respect earned through sheer competence. She set up a small, hand-lettered sign in her window, "Mending and sewing, all fabrics, including leather." Soon, a steady trickle of work came to her small room. She patched the canvas tarps used to cover mining wagons. She replaced the worn knees on a dozen pairs of denim trousers. She let out the seams on a dress for a young woman who was newly with child. Her work was not decorative. It was essential. It was the craft of holding things together against the constant, grinding wear of a hard life. Her hands, which Charles Hammond had seen as too strong and unfeminine, were now her salvation. They knew the language of strain and stress, how to fortify a weak point, how to make something last. She had, in the East, mended the uniforms of soldiers, men who were being sent into the fray. She knew how to stitch for survival, and the people of Elkridge, in their own daily battle against the mountain and the elements, recognized the value of what she could do. About 2 weeks after her arrival, she heard a pair of heavy boots stop outside her door, followed by a quiet knock. It was late afternoon, the time when Reed Callahan often passed through town on his way back to his ranch. She had seen him a few times from her window, a distant, steady figure on horseback, but he had not approached the boarding house since that first night. She opened the door to find him standing there, his hat in his hands. He was holding a bundle of heavy leather straps, the kind used for saddle rigging. "Miss Maddox," he said, his voice the same low, calm baritone she remembered. "Mrs. Wells said you might be able to help with this. The stitching's come loose on a few of my cinches." He wasn't looking at her with any particular intensity, but at the leather in his hands, as if he were a man more comfortable discussing objects than people. He extended the bundle to her. Claire took it, the weight and texture of the worn leather familiar in her grasp. She ran her thumb over the frayed linen thread. The work was shoddy, a quick repair done by an unskilled hand. "I can fix it," she said. "It will be stronger than before." "I don't doubt it," he replied. He glanced past her into the room, his eyes taking in the neat, organized workspace she had created by the window. He saw the spools of thread, the glint of steel, the piles of folded fabric. It was a workshop, an armory of domestic skill. His gaze came to rest on her hands as she tested the strength of the old seams. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sure, efficient movements of her fingers. "You sew," he said, not as a question, but as a slow, dawning observation, "as if you've patched up a battlefield." Claire's hands stilled. She looked up and met his eyes directly. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't complimenting her in the way other men might, with flowery, empty words. He was describing, with unnerving accuracy, the truth of her. He saw the history in her skill, the grim purposefulness she had learned while stitching the coats of men who might not return to claim them. He saw the strength others had mistaken for a flaw and gave it a name that was both stark and honorable. A dozen replies came to her mind, but none seemed right. She settled for the simple truth. "Something like that," she said, her voice quiet. A flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He gave a single nod. The conversation complete. "What do I owe you?" "I'll tell you when the work is done." "Fair enough," he said. He put his hat back on his head. "I'll be back through town in 2 days." And with that, he was gone. He returned in 2 days, as promised. Claire had not only restitched the cinches with heavy, doubled thread, she had also conditioned the dry leather and reinforced the buckle attachments. She had treated the job not as a simple repair, but as a restoration. Reed ran a calloused finger over her work, testing the seams. He looked impressed, a subtle lifting at the corner of his mouth the only sign. He paid her what she asked without haggling and took his leave. This became the beginning of a pattern. Reed never came for a social call. There was always a purpose, a practical reason for his presence. A horse blanket with a tear, a pair of leather gloves with a split seam, a bridle that needed a new keeper. Each time, he would come to her door, state his business, and watch for a moment as she examined the item. Their conversations were brief and to the point, orbits of quiet respect that never quite intersected. But sometimes, before he left, he would pause at the door. "Need anything?" he'd ask, his eyes scanning her small room. "More thread wax." The first time he asked, she was taken aback and simply shook her head. But the next time, she thought for a moment. "My awl is getting dull." He just nodded. 2 days later, he knocked on her door and handed her the tool. Its steel point honed to a razor-sharp edge. He had taken it to the blacksmith for her. He didn't wait for thanks, just touched the brim of his hat and left. His visits were never long. He never tried to sit down. He never pried into her past or asked about her future. He simply appeared, conducted his business, and offered quiet, practical help before disappearing again. He left her in peace. His presence was a steady, unobtrusive thing, like a shade tree on a hot day. You didn't notice it until you realized you were standing in its cool, quiet comfort. For a woman who had spent her life feeling like she took up too much space, his willingness to grant her all the space she needed was the most profound kindness of all. The turning of the seasons in Elkridge was not a gentle affair. Autumn did not so much arrive as it did conquer, sweeping down from the mountain with winds that carried the first bite of winter. For Claire Maddox, the change marked a settling. Her small room under the eaves was no longer just a refuge. It had become a workshop, a vital cog in the town's machinery of survival. Her life found a rhythm, measured not by the clock on the mantelpiece downstairs, but by the steady, rhythmic plunge of her needle. Her utility became an undeniable fact. The ranchers and prospectors who had once looked at her with suspicion now brought their ripped saddlebags and broken harnesses to her door, knowing the repair would be stronger than the original article. She developed a reputation for her work with leather. She understood its nature, how it stretched and tore, and how to stitch it back together with a seam that would hold against the pull of a panicked horse or the weight of a heavy load. They paid her in coin, and sometimes in goods a sack of flour, a slab of bacon, and their respect, while never warm, was grudgingly practical. She was useful, and in a place like Elkridge, utility was a virtue that could, for a time, overshadow peculiarity. Mrs. Wells's daughter, Lydia, a shy girl of 16 with her mother's practical nature but none of her hard edges, was to be married to a young blacksmith's apprentice. With a rare show of trust, Mrs. Wells commissioned Claire to make the wedding dress. It was not to be a confection of Eastern lace and silk, but a simple, elegant gown of fine blue wool, suitable for a life in the mountains. For weeks, Lydia would come for fittings in Claire's small room, in these quiet moments, surrounded by patterns and fabric. Claire's reserve would soften. She showed the young woman how to hold her shoulders, how to turn to make the drape of the skirt fall just so. She saw the hope and simple happiness in Lydia's eyes and felt a distant, bittersweet ache. While she pinned the hem, she would offer quiet advice. Not on marriage, but on fortitude. "Make sure your seams are strong," she told the girl once, her fingers deftly turning the fabric, "so they can bear the strain when life pulls." Lydia didn't seem to understand the deeper meaning, but she nodded all the same. When the dress was finished, it fit perfectly, and in it, the plain, shy girl was transformed into a woman of quiet beauty. Mrs. Wells paid her handsomely, her gruff "it'll do" the highest form of praise. Her most public contribution was to the town's small, one-room schoolhouse. The teacher, a young, earnest woman from Vermont named Miss Albright, despaired over the bare windows that let in a harsh glare in the morning and a bone-deep chill in the afternoon. The town council had no funds for such frivolities as curtains. Hearing of this, Claire took her own measurements, and using bolts of thick, undyed canvas from the general store paid for with her own earnings, she sewed 2 enormous pairs of curtains. She hung them herself one evening, climbing a rickety ladder while Miss Albright held it steady. The next day, the schoolroom was transformed. The light was softer, the room warmer. The children, for their part, were simply happy to have something new to look at. Claire had, in her quiet way, improved the life of the town's next generation. But usefulness was not the same as acceptance. As Claire's presence became more woven into the town's daily life, the whispers grew louder, not quieter. They were a low, constant hum beneath the surface of every interaction. At the general store, while she waited to purchase thread, she would feel the eyes on her back. She would see the women of the town, the wives of the merchants and the miners, draw their heads together, their hands cupped around their mouths. "Lives all alone, you know," she heard one of them, Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, murmur. "A woman of her age, it's not natural." "And so large," another, Mrs. Pritchard, would add, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "Built like a man. Charles Hammond was right to be wary. You wonder what sort of past she's running from." They never spoke directly to her. Of course, they would offer tight, closed-lip smiles and curt nods if their eyes happened to meet hers, a veneer of civility that was colder than any outright insult. They saw her strength not as a virtue, but as a deviation. Her solitude was not a choice, but a sign of some hidden flaw. The very skills that made her indispensable also made her suspect. A woman who could fend for herself so capably was a woman who, in their eyes, did not properly need a man, and that was a disruption to the natural order of things. Claire learned to live with the whispers. She built a wall of quiet dignity around herself, her face a calm, impassive mask. But behind the mask, the words were like small, sharp stones, pelting her spirit, raising bruises that no one could see. Each whisper was a confirmation of her oldest fear that she was, and always would be, an outsider. One crisp Sunday morning, driven by a deep, nameless longing for a sense of community, however flawed, she decided to go to church. She dressed in her best, a simple gown of dark gray wool she had made herself, and walked to the small white chapel that stood at the center of town. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a hush fell over the congregation. Every head turned. She saw surprise, then suspicion, then a cool, uniform blankness descend upon the faces of the townswomen. They looked away, presenting her with a sea of rigid backs and tightly pinned bonnets. The men shuffled their feet and cleared their throats, looking to their wives for a cue on how to react. Claire's courage faltered. For a moment, she considered turning and fleeing back to the safety of her room. But then she saw him. Reed Callahan was sitting not far from the front, beside an older couple who she guessed were his parents or kin. He did not turn with the others. He had already seen her enter, as her eyes met his across the silent, crowded room. He held her gaze. He didn't smile, nor did his expression change, but he gave a deliberate, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, one that no one else in the room would have even noticed. But to Claire, it was a lifeline. It was not a look of pity, nor was it an invitation. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement. It said, without a single word, "Asterisk, I see you, asterisk." It said, "Asterisk, you have a right to be here, asterisk." And most of all, it said, "Asterisk, I am not turning my back, asterisk." Taking a breath, Claire let the door swing shut behind her. She ignored the stairs and walked, her steps measured and even, to the very last pew in the back. She sat alone, an island in the last row, her hands folded in her lap. She kept her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church, but she was acutely aware of everything around her, the rustle of fabric as people settled, the faint scent of soap and wood smoke, the palpable wall of judgment that separated her from the rest of the congregation. The minister, Reverend Blackwood, began his sermon. He spoke of fellowship, of welcoming the stranger, of Christian charity. His words were filled with a soaring, noble sentiment that bore no resemblance to the cold reality of the room. Claire listened, and a bitter, lonely irony settled in her heart. She did not look at Reed again during the service. She didn't need to. That one brief moment of connection was enough. It was a small, warm coal that she held within her, a tiny point of heat against the encroaching chill of her isolation, while the rest of the town looked through her, or at her, as if she were a troubling puzzle. He had looked asterisk at asterisk her, and had seen a person. He hadn't run from the spectacle she'd made at the train station, and he wasn't running from the whispers that now followed her everywhere. He just sat there, a quiet, steady presence in a world of shifting opinions. When the final hymn was sung and the service was over, Claire did not linger. She slipped out the door before the pews began to empty, not wanting to navigate the gauntlet of polite but cold dismissals. As she stepped out into the bright, cold sunlight, she felt the wind on her face and took a deep breath. She was still alone. The whispers had not been silenced. The town had not magically opened its arms to her. But as she started the walk back to the boarding house, her back was a little straighter, her head held a little higher. Someone saw her, someone wasn't running, and for today, that was enough. The day of Lydia Wells' wedding dawned gray and heavy, the sky a seamless shroud of damp wool. By afternoon, a slow, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, turning the streets of Elkridge into a morass of dark, slick mud. The rain was a fitting accompaniment to the mood that had settled over Claire. From her window, she had watched the guests arrive at the small chapel, the women clutching their skirts and bonnets, the men turning their coat collars up against the damp. She saw Mrs. Wells, her face a rare mixture of pride and anxiety, hurrying her daughter inside. The beautiful blue wool of the wedding dress, a vibrant slash of color against the monochrome day. Claire had spent the morning finishing a small gift, a pair of finely embroidered pillowcases, and had left them on Lydia's bed before the girl had woken. It was her final contribution. She had no intention of attending the ceremony or the celebration that was to follow in the town hall. The thought of it was a physical ache, a tightening in her chest. A wedding was a celebration of belonging, of two people becoming a recognized part of the community's fabric. She was, at best, a necessary seamstress on the fringe of that fabric, a functional but separate thread. To attend would be to make her otherness a public spectacle. She could already picture the scene, the whispers behind gloved hands, the polite but distant nods, the awkward silence that would fall over any group she approached. She would be a lone gray rock in a river of celebration, and her presence would only serve to embarrass the Wells family, who had shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect. As evening fell, the drizzle turned into a steady, drumming rain. The sounds of the wedding reception, the distant, cheerful sawing of a fiddle, The rhythmic stomp of dancing feet and the occasional burst of collective laughter drifted through the wet air and seeped through the walls of the boarding house. The sounds were meant to be joyous, but to Claire, alone in her room, they were a kind of torture. Each note of music, each wave of laughter, was a fresh reminder of the invisible wall that stood between her and the world. She lit her lamp, the small flame pushing back the encroaching shadows. The room, which had been her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She had tried, she had worked hard, kept to herself, and offered her skills to this town. She had made herself useful, but she had mistaken utility for acceptance. The wall was still there, as high and as cold as ever. The whispers hadn't stopped, the looks hadn't softened, and a deep, bone-deep weariness finally settled over her, a fatigue that went far beyond physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of a lifetime spent trying to fit into spaces not built for her. And in that moment, a decision, which had been hovering in the back of her mind for weeks, solidified. It was time to go. There was no grand future waiting for her elsewhere. But the open road offered an honest loneliness, a solitude that did not pretend to be anything else. It was better than this hollow existence on the edge of a life she could never truly join. With a finality that felt both heartbreaking and liberating, she pulled her trunk out from under the bed. The sound of its wooden legs scraping against the floorboards was loud in the quiet room. She opened the lid, the faint scent of cedar and old journeys rising to meet her. Methodically, she began to pack. Her movements were calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the storm of emotion inside her. She folded her few dresses with precise, neat creases. She wrapped her brush and comb in a small cloth. She placed the worn book of poetry her mother had given her on top of the clothes. Each item was a small piece of her life, a life that felt spare and rootless. She was leaving nothing behind, because she had nothing to leave. No friends, no family, no connections that would fray if she departed. She was a ghost, and her leaving would be as quiet and unnoticed as her presence had been. She saved her sewing kit for last. She laid the felt case of needles, the polished thimbles, and the spools of thread into the trunk with a reverence she usually reserved for prayer. They were her tools, her curse, and her only true companions. They were the evidence of her strength, the very strength that made the world so uncomfortable with her. The lid of the trunk was closed. The clasps were latched. It was done. The stagecoach passed through at dawn, heading west, further into the unknown. She would be on it. She would leave a note for Mrs. Wells, along with payment for the room, and she would be gone before the town was fully awake. A sudden, sharp knock on her door made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one ever came to her room this late. She stood frozen for a moment, the sound of the rain and her own ragged breath filling the silence. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Miss Maddox." It was Reed Callahan's voice, low, calm, unmistakable. Her mind raced. What could he possibly want at this hour? On this night she thought of ignoring it, of pretending to be asleep. But there was a quiet insistence in his tone that she could not deny. With a deep, steadying breath, she crossed the room and opened the door. He stood in the dim hallway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat and glistening on the shoulders of his sheepskin coat. He held his hat in his hands as he stepped just inside the doorway, bringing the scent of wet wool and cold night air into the room with him. His eyes, steady and brown, immediately found the packed trunk sitting by the bed. His gaze lingered on it for a beat, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before returning to her face. He didn't mention the trunk. He seemed to understand that to do so would be an accusation, and that was not his way. "The whole town's over at the hall," he said, his voice quiet. "I noticed you weren't there. At the wedding." It wasn't a question, but it hung in the air like one. Why? Claire's hands clasped together in front of her, a nervous gesture she could not suppress. She looked down at them, unable to meet his direct, non-judgmental gaze. I was not invited. It was a weak lie, Mrs. Wells had made it clear she was welcome, an open invitation to the whole house. Reed was silent for a moment. He knew it was a lie, but he let it pass. Mrs. Wells would have been glad to have you, he stated simply, letting her know he saw through the pretense. The truth felt like a stone in her throat, but she had to give him something more. Evasion felt like an insult to his quiet sincerity. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. I did not wish to cause anyone embarrassment, she said, her voice barely a whisper. My being there, it would have made people uncomfortable. It would have reflected poorly on Lydia, on her wedding day. She laid the painful truth bare before him, the raw, humiliating belief that her very presence was a source of shame. She expected him to offer a polite, meaningless denial. She expected him to say, "Nonsense, no one would think that. That is what a kind person would say." Reed did not say that. He held her gaze, and she saw him truly considering her words, weighing the truth in them. He did not dismiss her feelings. He took them seriously, and that, in its own way, was more devastating than any platitude. The silence stretched, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. He looked from her face to the trunk and back again, and a quiet understanding dawned in his expression. He knew what this night meant. He knew what she was about to do. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it, softer, yet carrying a weight that filled the small room. I don't think they would have been embarrassed by you, he said, his eyes holding hers. He paused, a deep, thoughtful stillness in his posture. Then he added the rest. But if you leave, I would be... The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were utterly unexpected, a sentiment so foreign to her experience that her mind struggled to comprehend it. He wasn't talking about the town. He wasn't talking about the Wells family. He was talking about himself. He was not sad, not disappointed. He would be embarrassed asterisk. It was a strange, powerful, vulnerable word. It implied a sense of personal failure, as if her departure would be a stain on him, a testament to his own inability to make her feel she had a place here. For her entire life, she had been defined by how she made others feel uncomfortable, awkward, intimidated. Now, here was a man telling her that her absence would make him feel diminished. He was saying, in his own quiet, indirect way, that her presence mattered to him. The rigid wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart, the wall that had weathered a lifetime of slights and rejections, suddenly developed a deep, shattering crack, a hot rush of tears. The tears she had refused to shed at the train station pricked the back of her eyes. She fought them back, blinking fiercely. She could not speak. There were no words for the seismic shift that had just occurred within her. Reed seemed to understand. He had said what he came to say. He had laid his one card on the table. He did not press his advantage. He gave her a final, long look, a look that contained a world of unspoken understanding. And then he put his hat back on his head. "Good night, Miss Maddox," he said quietly. He turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the hall until they were gone. Claire stood in the open doorway for a long time, the cool, damp air washing over her. The sounds of the fiddle and the laughter from the town hall were still there, but they sounded different now, more distant, their edges softened. The rain still drummed on the roof, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like the steady, cleansing heartbeat of the world. Slowly, she pushed the door closed, the latch clicking softly into place. She crossed the room and stood before the trunk, her silent, waiting companion. She looked at it for a long time, a vessel filled with a future she had chosen only moments ago. Then, with a slow, deliberate hand, she reached down and unlatched the brass clasps. The sound echoed in the quiet room. She lifted the heavy lid and began to unpack. The weeks that followed the rainy night of Lydia Wells's wedding were marked by a subtle but profound shift. A quiet truce had been declared, not between Claire and the town, but within Claire herself. The decision to stay, prompted by Reed's startlingly vulnerable words, had not erased her loneliness, but it had changed its texture. It was no longer the sharp, jagged edge of imminent departure, but a softer, more settled quiet. She still kept to herself, but the rigid wall of her defense had become something more like a fence, with a gate that could, perhaps, be opened. Her work continued to be the anchor of her days. She was saving her money, coin by coin, with the vague notion of one day opening a proper shop instead of working from her small room. This nascent ambition required her to venture out more, to solicit work beyond the simple mending jobs that found their way to her. It was this that brought her to Reed Callahan's ranch north of town on a bright, cold autumn afternoon. The ranch was a place of controlled energy. It smelled of horses, hay, and hard work. Men moved with a quiet purposefulness that Claire recognized and respected. Reed had commissioned her to sew a set of heavy canvas covers for his winter feed stores, a large and difficult job that required precise measurements. She stood with him near the main corral, a notebook and pencil in her hand, discussing the placement of grommets and the strength of the seams, when the clear afternoon air was suddenly shattered. It happened with the terrifying speed of a lightning strike. A young, half-broken colt in a nearby training pen, spooked by the sharp crack of a distant hunter's rifle, exploded into a frenzy of pure panic. Its eyes rolled white, its powerful body bucking and twisting against the ropes that held it. A young ranch hand, no older than Lydia's new husband, was inside the pen, and he froze, his inexperience leaving him paralyzed in the face of the horse's violent terror. Before anyone could shout a warning, Reed was moving. He didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the fence, his body fluid and sure, his voice a low, calming rumble aimed at the terrified animal. "Easy now. Easy, boy." He moved to place himself between the horse and the petrified ranch hand, his focus entirely on de-escalating the danger. He managed to shove the young man backward, out of the immediate path of the flailing hooves. For a moment, it seemed he had the situation under control. But the colt, blind with fear, reared violently. Its powerful hind legs lashed out, not with malice, but with the unthinking force of a cornered animal. Reed tried to pivot away, but he wasn't fast enough. There was a sickening, hollow thud as a hoof caught him high on his left leg, just below the knee. A sharp, cracking sound, audible even over the horse's frantic snorting, sliced through the air. Reed's leg buckled beneath him, and he went down hard in the dusty churn of the corral. The colt, its panic finally spent, bolted to the far side of the pen, trembling and snorting. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The other ranch hands were frozen, their mouths agape, shocked into immobility. The young man Reed had saved was pale, his back pressed against the fence. They were all staring, processing the sudden, brutal violence of the moment. All but one. Claire didn't remember making a decision. Her body acted before her mind had a chance to think, propelled by an instinct so deep and powerful it bypassed all her hard-won caution and reserve. The notebook and pencil fell from her hands, forgotten in the dust. She lifted her skirts and ran, her long legs covering the distance to the corral with a speed that stunned the men who watched. She didn't pause at the fence but climbed through the rails, heedless of the splintered wood or the mud that stained her dress. The world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Reed, lying on the ground, his face pale and tight with pain, trying to push himself up on his elbows. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice low and steady, cutting through the shocked silence. It was the voice she had used years ago, tending to wounded men, a voice that carried an authority born of necessity. She knelt beside him in the dirt, her usual composure replaced by a fierce, protective energy that radiated from her like heat. Her work bag, which she always carried, was still slung over her shoulder. She shrugged it off, her hands already working, her mind clear and ruthlessly efficient. She saw the unnatural angle of his leg, the way the denim of his trousers was already darkening with blood. "It's the bone!" he gritted out, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "I heard it snap." "I know," she said, her voice softer now, meant only for him. "Be still." Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision. From her bag, she pulled her cutting shears and, without hesitation, sliced through the tough fabric of his trousers from ankle to thigh. Exposing the injury, it was bad. The break was clean, but severe, and a sharp edge of bone had torn through the flesh. The other men had started to move now, their paralysis broken by the sight of her actions. They crowded around the fence, their faces a mixture of horror and awe. "Someone get the doctor!" one of them yelled. "Someone fetch the wagon!" Claire paid them no mind. She knew the doctor was miles away in the next county, and it would be hours before he could get here. Hours Reed didn't have to spare with an injury this severe. From her bag, she pulled out a roll of clean, undyed cotton, the fabric she was saving to line a winter coat. With her shears, she began tearing it into long, wide strips. The clean, ripping sound was the only noise in the now hushed corral. She worked quickly, her focus absolute. She instructed one of the stunned ranch hands to fetch a bucket of clean water from the well, and another to find 2 flat, sturdy pieces of wood for a splint. When they returned, she gently but firmly cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly delicate for hands that were so strong. Reed watched her, his face a mask of pain, but his eyes were clear and fixed on her. Through the agony, he saw not a seamstress, but a warrior. He saw the same quiet competence he had always seen, now forged into a tool of immediate, life-saving action. As she worked, she murmured to him, her voice low and soothing, the way he spoke to a frightened horse. "Just breathe. Stay with me. I've got you." Using the strips of cotton, she expertly padded the broken leg, then laid the wooden boards on either side. She began to wrap the limb, her movements deft and sure, pulling the fabric tight to immobilize the bone. She was using the tools of her quiet life, the shears, the cloth, the strong, capable hands to mend not a torn seam, but a broken man. The scraps and remnants of her trade were being repurposed into an act of profound and desperate care. The men of the ranch watched in utter astonishment. This was Claire Maddox, the quiet, tall woman from the boarding house, the woman they whispered about, the woman who kept to herself, the woman who was not right for this town. They had seen her as an oddity, a solitary figure defined by her silence and her unusual height. They had never imagined this. They had never imagined the fierce, commanding competence that now burned in her, or the raw, undisguised tenderness in her hands as she tended to their boss. "Who knew she cared for him like that?" one of them whispered to another, his voice filled with a dawning, confused respect. They didn't know. They couldn't know. They had only ever seen the surface. They had never seen the quiet understanding that passed between Claire and Reed in her small room, the unspoken acknowledgement of strength, the shared language of silence. They had no way of knowing that his words on a rainy night had saved her from disappearing, and that she was now, in her own way, returning the favor. But Reed knew. As she tied the final knot on the makeshift splint, her face inches from his, he reached out a shaky hand and grasped hers. His grip was weak, but his intent was clear. "Claire," he breathed, his voice rough with pain. She stopped, her hands covering his. She looked into his eyes, and in their pain depths, she saw no surprise, only a deep, quiet confirmation of everything that had remained unspoken between them. He had known she would be the one, in the chaos and the agony. Her presence was the one thing that made sense. He had seen the strength in her from the very beginning, and he was not surprised to find it was strong enough to hold him now. The doctor finally arrived from the neighboring county near midnight, a portly, irritable man who smelled of whiskey and wet wool. He clucked his tongue at Claire's handiwork, repositioned the splint with a few painful, expert movements, and declared that Reed was lucky to have had someone with a level head nearby. He set the bone as best he could, stitched the wound, and left a bottle of laudanum for the pain and a stark warning stay off the leg for at least 2 months, or risk being crippled for life. There was no question of moving Reed to a proper bed in town. His ranch was his home, his world, and he refused to leave it. So, his men transformed the largest of the empty stalls into a makeshift infirmary. They swept it clean of every last piece of stray straw, laid down fresh, sweet-smelling hay in a thick mattress, and covered it with clean blankets and canvas. They hung lanterns from the beams, casting a warm, steady glow that kept the dark corners at bay. It was a strange sick room, filled with the familiar, comforting sense of hay and leather, and the soft, rhythmic sounds of the horses shifting and breathing in the neighboring stalls. And it was there that Claire's vigil began. She did not return to her room at the boarding house, except to collect her things. She explained the situation to a surprisingly understanding Mrs. Wells, who simply nodded and said, "The man needs you. Go on." Claire moved into the ranch's small, unused foreman's cabin, a stone's throw from the barn, but her days, and many of her nights, were spent in the stall with Reed. A new routine, a new rhythm, took over her life. It was a rhythm of care, of quiet, constant attention. Each morning, she would arrive as the sun was just beginning to touch the mountain peaks, carrying a bowl of hot porridge or a clear, nourishing broth. She would help Reed sit up, her movements strong and sure, and then she would tend to his leg. Changing the bandages was an act of profound, unspoken intimacy. She would carefully unwrap the bloodied linen, her touch gentle, her focus absolute. She cleaned the angry, stitched wound with a quiet efficiency that belied the deep well of emotion churning within her. In these moments, the world outside the stall ceased to exist. There were only her capable hands, the stark reality of his injury, and the complete, unwavering trust he placed in her. He never flinched from her touch, his eyes often watching her face, not the wound, as if her calm expression was the only anesthetic he needed. The pain was a constant, sullen beast in the first few days. It was a sharp, predatory thing that left him pale and sweating. He refused the laudanum, hating the dull, foggy state it induced, preferring the clarity of agony. During the worst of it, Claire would simply sit with him, a cool, damp cloth in her hand to wipe his brow. She wouldn't offer empty platitudes or useless reassurances. She would just be there, a steady, silent presence against the pain, and her quiet fortitude seemed to give him strength. As the days bled into a week, then 2, a comfortable domesticity settled over the stall. The ranch hands, who had once viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and awe, now treated her with a deep, quiet respect. They would leave buckets of fresh water outside the stall, or a piece of freshly baked bread from the cookhouse. They saw her not as an intruder, but as the quiet, undisputed guardian of their boss. To fill the long, slow hours of healing, Claire began to read to him. She had found a few worn books in the main house, a copy of Shakespeare, a thick almanac, and a Bible. She read in a low, even voice, the words filling the quiet space between them. She read of planting seasons and constellations from the almanac, of psalms and proverbs from the Bible. The stories and the cadence of her voice were a soothing balm, a distraction from the throbbing in his leg and the maddening inactivity. He would lie back against the propped-up saddle that served as his pillow, his eyes closed, and just listen. He was a man of action, of open spaces and wide horizons, and to be confined to this small square of hay and blankets was a special kind of hell. But the sound of her voice seemed to push the walls back, to make the world a little bigger again. One late afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the accident, a deep quiet had fallen over them. She had finished reading a chapter of Proverbs and had set the book aside. The sun was setting. casting long, golden shafts of light through the slats of the barn wall, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air. The ranch was settling down for the evening. The sounds of work had faded, replaced by the soft nickering of horses and the distant call of a night bird. Claire looked at Reed. He was asleep, or seemed to be, his breathing deep and even. His face, in repose, had lost its hard, pain-etched lines, and he looked younger, more vulnerable. A thick lock of dark hair had fallen across his forehead. Without thinking, she reached out and gently brushed it back into place. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against the warmth of his skin, a touch that sent a surprising jolt through her. He stirred, and his eyes opened. He hadn't been asleep. He had been watching her through his lashes. Her hand flew back as if she'd been burned, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. She was suddenly, acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation, of the long hours she'd spent in this intimate space with him. She was the town spectacle, the solitary woman. Whispers must be running rampant. She had overstayed. She was being too much. The old fears, the familiar chorus of self-doubt, came rushing back. She stood up abruptly, her movements stiff. "It's late," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally formal. "You should get some rest. I'll come back in the morning." She turned to go, her heart pounding. It was the right thing to do, the proper thing. To stay longer would be to invite speculation, to cross a line that she hadn't even realized existed until the moment her fingers had touched his skin. She had taken only 2 steps towards the stall door when his hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was not rough, but it was firm, a tether that stopped her cold. She looked back, her breath caught in her throat. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, his face taut with an emotion she couldn't name. "Don't go," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. He seemed to search for the right words, his gaze intense. Then he found them. "Don't go," he repeated, "unless you really want to." The world stopped. The words were a quiet detonation in the still air of the barn. He wasn't telling her to stay for his sake. He wasn't commanding her or pleading for a nurse. He was asking her, for the first time in her life, to consult her own heart. He was giving her a choice, and the choice was not about duty, or propriety, or what the town might think. It was about her. What did she want? She stood there, frozen, his hand a warm, solid weight around her wrist. All her life, her actions had been dictated by the expectations and reactions of others, avoiding their judgment, managing their discomfort, earning their grudging acceptance. She had never been asked to simply consider her own desire. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and the carefully constructed walls inside her crumbled to dust. She saw the question in his eyes, the hope, the vulnerability, and when she looked inside herself, past the fear and the ingrained habit of self-denial, she found the answer. It was simple, clear, and undeniable. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to walk out into the lonely dusk. She didn't want to return to the empty foreman's cabin. She wanted to stay here, in the warm, hay-scented dimness of the stall. She wanted to sit in the quiet with this man who saw her not as too much, but as essential. Slowly, without a word, she turned back. She let him release her wrist, and then she sank down to sit on the clean straw beside his makeshift bed. He shifted, making room for her, and his hand found hers again, his fingers lacing through hers. This time, she did not pull away. She had sat with him for weeks out of a sense of duty, out of a need to repay the quiet kindness he had shown her. But now, as she settled beside him, their hands clasped together in the fading light, it was different. For the first time, Claire Maddox sat down not because she had to, but because it was exactly where in the world she wanted to be. The first true snows of winter came in early December, blanketing Elkridge in a thick, sound-dampening layer of white. The air grew sharp and clean, and the smoke from every chimney rose in a straight, gray column into the crystalline sky. With the snow came a festive, communal spirit that had been absent during the grim, hard-working months. It was time for the annual winter festival, a tradition held in the town hall to celebrate the harvest being in, the mines being secured against the worst of the weather, and the simple fact of having survived another year. Reed was walking now, his recovery a slow but steady progress. He used a thick, sturdy cane carved from a single piece of hickory, and his leg was still stiff and weak, but the bone was mending. He had moved back into the main ranch house, and Claire had returned to her room at the boarding house. The change had left an unexpected hollowness in her days. The quiet intimacy of the barn, the shared rhythm of care and healing, had been replaced by a polite, respectful distance. They still saw each other. He would ride into town, or she would walk out to the ranch to deliver a mended item, but the dynamic had shifted back to something more formal, more public. It was during one such visit, a week before the festival, that he asked her. He was standing on the porch of the ranch house, leaning on his cane, the late afternoon sun casting a long shadow behind him. "The town's holding its winter dance on Saturday," he said, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered peak of the mountain. "I was wondering if you would accompany me." Claire's hands, tucked into her muff for warmth, tightened into fists. The winter festival, the single largest social gathering of the year. It was a terrifying prospect. To walk into that hall, filled with every person who had ever stared, whispered, or judged, was to willingly step into the lion's den. "I don't dance," she said, the excuse sounding weak even to her own ears. "I'm not much good for it myself these days," he replied, tapping his injured leg with the cane. "But a man still needs a reason to wash the trail dust off and pretend he's civilized for an evening." He finally turned to look at her, his brown eyes steady and serious. "I would be honored if you would go with me. Claire." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal Miss preceding it. The sound of it on his lips, spoken in that low, calm voice, was both startling and deeply affecting. He wasn't asking her to be his nurse or his seamstress. He was asking her to be his partner for the evening. He was asking her to stand with him, in front of everyone. He was offering a public alliance, a silent declaration. Looking into his unwavering eyes, she found she could not refuse. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time, it was overshadowed by something else, a desire not to disappoint him, and a flicker of a desire not to disappoint herself. "I would be glad to," she said, her voice quiet but firm. In the days leading up to the festival, Claire worked with a focused, feverish intensity. She was not mending torn canvas or reinforcing worn leather. She was creating. From a bolt of fabric she had been saving for a special occasion, a deep, rich navy blue wool, the color of a twilight sky, she began to sew a dress. This was not a dress of concealment. It was not designed to make her seem smaller or softer or less herself. The cut was simple and elegant, following the tall, strong lines of her body. The sleeves were long and fitted, the bodice tailored to her frame, and the skirt full but unadorned with the frivolous ruffles and bows favored by the other women. It was a dress of quiet confidence, a garment that was as honest and as sturdy as she was. As she stitched the final seams, her needle flying with practiced skill, she felt as though she were stitching a new skin for herself, one made not of fear and apology, but of dignity and self-possession. On the night of the festival, she dressed with care. The navy wool felt heavy and substantial against her skin. She braided her hair and coiled it neatly at the nape of her neck, a severe style that highlighted the strong line of her jaw and the clarity of her gray eyes. When she looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand, she did not see the awkward, oversized woman from the train platform. She saw herself, Claire Maddox, and for the first time, that seemed to be enough. Reed arrived at the boarding house promptly at 7. He was dressed in a dark, well-fitting suit and a clean white shirt. He had shaved, and his hair was neatly combed, without the dust of the trail on him. He looked different, more formal, but no less solid. He held his hat in one hand and his hickory cane in the other. When he saw her descend the stairs, he simply stood and watched, and the look in his eyes was more potent than any flowery compliment. It was a look of pure, unadorned appreciation. He offered her his arm, the one not holding the cane. "You look beautiful, Claire," he said, his voice low. She placed her hand on his forearm. The wool of his coat was solid and warm beneath her fingers. It was an anchor. Together, they stepped out into the cold, clear night. The town hall was ablaze with light and sound. The fiddles were playing a lively reel, and the air was thick with the scent of pine boughs, wood smoke, and baking pies. Through the windows, they could see the crowd, a swirling kaleidoscope of color and motion. As they reached the door, Claire's courage wavered. The knot of fear in her stomach tightened. Reed must have felt her tremble, because his hand briefly covered hers on his arm. "Just stay with me," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The fiddler's bow scraped to a halt mid-note. The rhythmic stomp of the dancers ceased. Every conversation died in the middle of a word. A profound, charged silence fell over the entire hall, and every single pair of eyes, the curious, the scornful, the surprised, swung to fix upon them, standing in the doorway. They were a startling sight, the tall, solitary seamstress, a striking figure in her severe navy gown, her hand resting on the arm of Reed Callahan, the quiet, respected rancher who was leaning on a cane. They were two solitudes, combined into a single, unignorable presence. Claire felt the weight of 100 gazes like a physical blow. The old instinct screamed at her to drop her head, to shrink, to apologize for her very existence. She could feel the hot blush rising on her neck. She saw Mrs. Gable's mouth fall open in a perfect O of shock. She saw Charles Hammond, standing with a petite, simpering woman, his face a mask of disbelief and what looked like a flicker of bitter regret. But then she felt the steady, unwavering strength of the arm beneath her hand. She felt Reed's presence beside her, as solid and as unmovable as the mountain itself. He was looking straight ahead, his expression calm, his gaze sweeping over the silent crowd without a trace of concern or apology. He was utterly unashamed to be there with her. And in that moment, something inside Claire shifted. Drawing a deep breath, she lifted her chin. She did not shrink. She did not look away. For the first time in her life, under the full, crushing weight of public scrutiny, she met their stares head-on. Her gray eyes were clear and steady. She stood tall, her posture as elegant and unyielding as the dress she wore. The silence stretched for an impossibly long time. Then, the mayor, flustered, cleared his throat and gestured to the musicians. "Well, don't stop on our account, play a waltz." The fiddle started up again, this time with the slow, graceful 3/4 time of a waltz. The music felt hesitant at first, fragile in the charged atmosphere. Reed turned to her, his eyes crinkling just slightly at the corners. "May I have this dance?" he asked, as formally as if they were in a grand ballroom. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He led her to the center of the cleared floor, his limp more pronounced as he moved without his cane. The other couples held back, forming a wide, watching circle around them. Reed turned to face her, his right hand finding the small of her back, his left taking her hand. She expected him to lead with force, to compensate for his weak leg with a strong arm. It was how she had always been handled, like something that needed to be managed, to be controlled. But Reed's touch was different. It was a gentle invitation, a light but steady pressure that guided rather than commanded. He did not pull her or push her. He simply supported her, creating a space for her to move within. And so they danced. It was a slow, careful waltz, a simple rotation in the center of the silent, watching room. He bore his weight on his good leg. using her for balance as much as he guided her. They were supporting each other. Her height, which had always made dancing an awkward, mismatched affair, was suddenly perfect. She met his gaze directly, without having to look up or down. She did not tremble. The fear had vanished, replaced by a strange and wonderful sense of calm. The warmth from his hand spread through her, chasing away the last of the chill. The room, the stairs, the whispers, they all faded away, until the only things that existed were his steady brown eyes, the gentle music, and the solid, reassuring pressure of his hand on her back. She moved with a grace she never knew she possessed, her body intuitively following his quiet lead. She was not the town oddity. She was not the overly tall seamstress. She was not an object of pity or scorn. In the circle of his arm, under the gaze of the entire town, Claire felt, for the very first time in her life, simply and truly, like a woman, a beautiful one. They did not stay at the festival for long after the waltz. Their purpose had been served. The statement had been made in the center of that dance floor, a silent, irrefutable declaration that resonated more powerfully than any spoken words. They had faced the town together, and the town had blinked first. The whispers and stares that followed them as they moved through the hall had a new quality, now no longer just scorn and suspicion, but a grudging, confused awe. Reed retrieved his cane, and with a polite nod to the mayor and a quiet word with a few of his ranch hands, he led Claire back toward the door. She walked with her hand still resting on his arm, a position that now felt entirely natural, entirely right. Stepping out of the hot, crowded hall and back into the pristine cold of the night was like waking from a strange, intense dream. The air was still and sharp, the sky a vast, starless canopy of deep velvet. The sounds of the festival, the fiddles, the laughter, the stomping feet were instantly muffled, fading behind them as they began the slow walk back to the boarding house. The main street of Elkridge, usually a track of frozen mud and grit, was now transformed, covered in a smooth, untouched blanket of fresh snow. Theirs were the first footprints to mark its surface, two parallel tracks moving as one. They walked in a comfortable silence, a silence different from any they had shared before. It was not the patient, waiting silence of his visits to her sewing room, nor the companionable silence of their time in the barn. This was a silence of deep, mutual understanding, a quiet space filled with the shared memory of what had just transpired. There was nothing that needed to be said. They had stood together, and that was language enough. The world seemed to have shrunk to just the two of them, moving through a sleeping town. The crunch of their boots in the snow was the only sound, a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the beating of Claire's own heart. She was intensely aware of the solid warmth of his arm beneath her hand, of the way his presence beside her felt like a shield against the cold, against the world. The fear and tension that had been her constant companions for so long had finally receded, leaving in their place a quiet, fragile sense of peace. As they passed the dark, hulking shape of the blacksmith's workshop, the air began to change. A few impossibly delicate snowflakes drifted down, catching the faint starlight, glittering like tiny diamonds before vanishing on the dark wool of Reed's coat. Then a few more, and a few more after that. Within moments, a gentle, steady snowfall had begun, the flakes large and perfectly formed, spiraling down around them in a silent, mesmerizing dance. Reed stopped, looking up into the falling snow. "Looks like winter's truly decided to settle in," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. He guided her off the main path, leading her to the shelter of the blacksmith's long, covered overhang, a space where horses were usually shoed. The roof protected them from the falling snow, creating a small, intimate pocket of stillness. From their vantage point, they could watch as the world was gently, inexorably, covered in white. The snow fell on the rooftops and the fences, softening the town's hard, practical edges, transforming it into something beautiful, something almost magical. Claire watched, her heart filled with an emotion so new and so overwhelming she could not put a name to it. The beauty of the snow, the quiet strength of the man beside her, the memory of the waltz, the feeling of his hand in hers, it all coalesced into a single, perfect moment of exquisite vulnerability. The armor she had worn for a lifetime had been stripped away, leaving her soul open to the cold night air, and it was terrifying, and it was wonderful. She turned to look at him. His profile was strong and calm in the dim light, his gaze fixed on the falling snow. He was so steady, so patient. He had never pushed, never demanded, never tried to change her or make her smaller. He had simply waited. He had simply seen her, and in doing so, he had given her a gift she had never known. She was missing the freedom to see herself. A lifetime of fear and longing rose in her throat, and the words came out in a raw, trembling whisper, a confession of her deepest, most guarded secret. "I always thought," she began, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the hush of the snowfall, "that the first night I truly let myself love someone, it would break me." The words hung between them, fragile and terrifying. She was speaking of the ultimate act of intimacy, the final surrender. For her, a woman who had always been too much, the act of joining with another had always seemed like a kind of self-destruction. It would mean shattering her own carefully guarded wholeness to fit a man's expectations, to make herself acceptable, to finally become not too much. It was a breaking she had always feared more than her own loneliness. Reed turned his head slowly, his gaze leaving the snow to rest on her face. There was no confusion in his eyes, no misinterpretation. He heard the lifetime of fear packed into her quiet words. He understood that she was not speaking of a physical act, but of the surrender of her very soul. He didn't speak. Instead, he lifted his free hand, the one that wasn't holding his cane, and gently, so gently, touched her cheek. His fingers were calloused and cool from the night air, but his touch was incredibly warm. It was not a touch of possession or of passion, but one of profound tenderness and reassurance. It grounded her, calming the sudden, wild fluttering in her chest. He held her gaze, his brown eyes deep and serious in the snowy dimness. When he finally spoke, his voice was a soft, steady anchor in the swirling vortex of her emotions. "Then don't give it to anyone," he said, his thumb stroking her cheekbone in a slow, comforting rhythm. "Not until you want to." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over her. "I can wait. I can wait." The three simple words were the most beautiful sentence she had ever heard. They were a promise, a gift, a release. He was not a conqueror, claiming his prize. He was a guardian, offering sanctuary. He was telling her that her feelings, her fears, her readiness, her choice mattered more than anything else. He was offering her the one thing no one else ever had the luxury of: time, and the complete, unquestioning respect for her own heart. He was not afraid of her strength. He was a steward of her vulnerability. The tears she had held back all night finally welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a sense of relief so profound it felt like a physical release, like a heavy weight being lifted from her soul. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cold cheek, and he gently wiped it away with his thumb. She didn't have to say thank you. He didn't need to say anything more. They simply stood there, together under the blacksmith's overhang, their silence now filled with a new, deeper intimacy. They watched the snow continue to fall, a soft white curtain descending, closing them off from the rest of the world. They were in no hurry. The night was theirs, and there was no pressure to fill it with anything other than this quiet, shared understanding. And as she stood there, his hand warm on her cheek, the gentle snow falling all around, Claire realized that the deep, primal fear that had haunted her for so long was finally, truly gone. It was the first night of her life that she did not feel afraid of love, of being known, of being broken. Not because a hero had ridden in to save her, but because a good, quiet man had chosen to stand with her in the storm and had promised to wait until she was ready to walk out of it on her own. Winter thawed into a muddy, hopeful spring, and with the melting of the snow came a fundamental change in the landscape of Claire's life. The money she had so carefully saved, coin by coin, was enough. A small, long-disused storefront on the main street, which had once been a failed assayer's office, became available for rent. With a quiet determination that was now her hallmark, Claire secured it. The transformation of the space was her own personal reclamation project. She scrubbed the floors until the old wood gleamed, washed the grimy front window until the sunlight streamed in, and painted the walls a simple, clean white. She moved her work table, her spools of thread, and her bolts of fabric from the cramped room at the boarding house into this new, bright, open space. Above the door, she hung a simple, beautifully lettered sign, "C. Maddox, Seamstress and Tailor." It was more than a shop. It was a statement. It was a physical manifestation of the space she had carved out for herself in Elkridge. Not on the fringes, but right in its very heart. People who had once whispered about her as they passed now stopped to peer in the window, marveling at the neatness, the industry, the sheer fact of her permanence. She was no longer a temporary resident, a piece of driftwood washed up on their shores. She was a business owner. She was a part of the town. The business thrived. Her reputation for quality, durable work was unshakable. She was no longer just mending, she was creating. She tailored suits for the town's merchants, sewed sturdy work clothes for the miners, and was sought out by every prospective bride for miles around. The work became more than she could handle alone. She hired a young woman named Annie, a quiet, hard-working girl from a large family, who had always shown a knack for needlework. Annie was initially terrified of Claire, having grown up on the town's whispers. But she soon found not a forbidding giant, but a patient, exacting teacher. Claire taught her the secrets of a strong seam, the art of measuring a perfect line, the importance of quality thread. In their quiet hours together, hunched over the large work table, a new dynamic emerged. Claire, the perennial outsider, had become a mentor, passing on her craft, building a future not just for herself, but for another young woman in the town. They were working on a particularly intricate wedding gown one late afternoon. The shop was quiet, filled with the soft, golden light of the setting sun. The only sounds were the snip of Claire's shears through a piece of satin and the low hum of Annie carefully stitching a line of seed pearls onto the bodice. The bell above the door remained silent, as it always did at this hour. There was no need. Reed Callahan's arrival was as predictable and as comforting as the sunset itself. His routine had begun shortly after she opened the shop. Every evening, as the workday was winding down, he would ride into town from the ranch. He would tie his horse to the hitching post outside, but he would not come in to interrupt her work. Instead, he would lean against the outer door frame, or sit on a low stool he kept propped there for that purpose. He never spoke much. Sometimes he and Claire would exchange a quiet greeting, a simple nod. Mostly, he would just sit, his hat tipped low, his presence a silent, steady vigil. The town had grown accustomed to the sight. It had become a part of the daily landscape, as natural as the blacksmith quenching his steel at the end of the day. The sight of the quiet rancher waiting for the tall seamstress was no longer a source of gossip, but a kind of local landmark, a testament to a patience so profound it had become an accepted fact of life. He was not waiting for a conversation, or for a meal. He was simply waiting for her. On this particular afternoon, Claire was concentrating on a difficult cut. She was aware of him, as she always was. His presence was a quiet warmth at the edge of her perception. She finished the cut, laying the shears down with a soft click, and looked up to see Annie staring, not at her work, but towards the door. A small, knowing smile on her face. Claire followed her gaze. Reed was not on his stool today. He was standing in the open doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the brilliant gold and orange of the evening sky. He had taken off his hat, and he held it in his hands. He wasn't looking at the street, or at the sky. He was looking at her. Their eyes met across the sun-dusted room. In his gaze, she saw the same quiet steadiness she had seen that first day, but now it was layered with a deep, abiding affection that needed no words. He had kept his promise. He had waited. Through the long months of winter and the hopeful thaw of spring, he had waited for her to heal, not just her body, but her soul. He had given her the space to build this life, to find her footing, to become the woman who now stood confidently in her own shop, the master of her own destiny. Slowly, he extended his hand. It was not a grand gesture. It was a simple, open-palmed offer. It was the same hand that had carried her trunk, the same hand that had steadied her in the dance, the same hand that had held hers through the long, painful nights in the barn. It was a hand that offered not possession, but partnership. It asked for nothing, but offered everything. The shop was utterly still. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the golden air. Annie had stopped her work, her head bowed, pretending to be absorbed in her stitching, giving them the illusion of privacy. Claire looked at his outstretched hand. It was a working man's hand, calloused and strong, but it was the gentlest hand she had ever known. She thought of the long road that had brought her to this moment, the humiliation on the train platform, the lonely nights, the whispers, the fear. And she thought of the quiet man who had met all of it not with force, but with a patience that had been strong enough to shield her, to let her grow into herself. The fear of being broken, of being too much, was a distant ghost, a memory from another lifetime. She was not broken. She was whole. She was not too much. She was exactly, perfectly enough. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to light up the room. Without a word, she wiped her hands on her apron, took a step away from the work table, and gave a single, deliberate nod. She walked towards him, her steps sure and even. She did not rush. She met him in the center of the room that she had built, in the life that she had made. As she reached him, she looked into his waiting eyes, and her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and as steady as her heart. "I think," she said softly, "I'm ready now." Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.